Hello, my friends. Thanks so much for your company today. Do you know how I often shout out, asking you to let me know who you'd like to hear interviewed? Well, this week we have one of your picks in tow, and he's a real beauty. He's hard rock singer, Australian television personality, actor, and all round legend, Gary Angry Anderson, who's best known as the frontman for those original rock and roll outlaws, Rose Tattoo. Now, I'm aware that if you grew up in Australia, you'll know these guys well. You may not like their sound, but you've certainly heard it because Angry Anderson and Rose Tattoo have been belting that sound out religiously in pubs and clubs all over the country since the late 70s. If you're not a native and haven't heard of Angry Anderson yet, strap in now and get set for a fast introduction to the world of Aussie blues-infused hard rock that's delivered so loud it's likely to send you deaf.
Yes, let's
All
go.
right. Angry Anderson, you are now 77 years old. Are you still angry?
Yeah. Now that's an interesting, very interesting question. I don't think I've been asked that for 20, maybe 30 years. But I remember in the early days, it was more about, well, what makes you angry? And the things that got me the nickname in the early days was the fact that I seemed to be, particularly to the person that gave me the nickname, we were best mates, and we used to share flats and houses and stuff for quite a few years. He thought I was disproportionately, for my size, aggressive in manner, not so much in actuality, because contrary to popular belief, I was never a seasoned street fighter, and I've never been a person that's been prolifically physically violent. And I think that was because of my upbringing, but that's another story. What makes me now angry is the injustices. And this has been a common thing with me for many, many, many years. And I remember two things you find out once you leave Australia to travel the world is how much you appreciate having been born in Australia and living the lifestyle. So the things that make me angry now have changed over the years, but yes, I still am.
I get that you're into a whole lot of social issues and you have been for quite some time, and I do want to talk about those. I don't want to play those down at all. And what you've done for this country in terms of making a stand can't be discounted at all. But I do want to wind the clock back. You said that your family called you Gary. You got the nickname Angry. It seems to me that you kind of started out with a bit of short man syndrome. Is that what what would have happened?
Ouch! Absolutely. 100%. Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about how you grew up. I know you had a difficult childhood. I'm not asking you for a whole lot of detail around that. But how did it impact you, and how did you find your way to music and to expressing everything that you had inside of you as a result?
I think I've now embraced the philosophic view of the journey because I'm old enough now to do that. I'm at an age now where looking back is a greater distance than looking forward. And that's a very interesting perspective, or a very interesting place to be in. And I hate to use the term one's life. It sounds so pompous. But having said that,
I think we can all relate to what you're saying.
yeah, I'm doing a book at the moment. So I've been writing stuff for years about my life. So a lot of it's going to come out in the book. I can talk about these things,
You
obviously.
can.
So,
I'll promo the book when that comes out too, I promise. And perhaps
thank
have
you.
another chat.
I grew up in a Melbourne suburb called Pascoe Vale. The first 6 years of my life, we lived with my biological father's my mother and father. After 6 years, we moved out of my grandparents' home. It was a very rough area that I lived in. But when I say rough, it was hard because it was working class to the bone. There were no middle class people. I was resisting to become one of the more violent or the more tough or the more physical boys because I was little. And getting back to
Uh-huh.
you pointing that very, very, very structural dynamic. If you're little, you see the world.
From a
As I
different
said,
perspective.
absolutely.
How tall are you now?
Well, I used to be 5'2".
Okay, so you're a little guy at school, you've gone into the big school, you try not to be one of the tough guys, you're looking up at everybody, trying to kind of hang back. But I feel like you're still reeling inside. There's stuff that's got to come out of you. How do you find music?
I was brought up with music. The difficult thing to talk about is that when my father brought mum here from Mauritius, and he was still then a competitive and riding. He was a jockey, so he was away a lot. And his younger brother Ivan was a full-time musician. I spent a lot of time with Ivan, who was largely responsible for the abuse that took place. So Ivan introduced me to music, and it was where I went.
To escape.
Yeah.
What artists on the radio started influencing you most?
The music that changed my whole life, which was, of course, rock and roll. But I still, to this day, when I hear Begin to Begin, I cry. You begin to begin. It was where I went to hide. It protected me. And later on, as you quite rightfully pointed out, it was the way that these things that were welling up inside me, emotions, it was a way to express that.
You set out wanting to be a blues guitarist, though, didn't you?
I did, because one of the earliest influences, apart from the rock and roll guitar players, Elvis, Carl Perkins, Gene Vincent, Ricky Nelson. I was obsessed with Ricky Nelson for many years because of his wonderful country, easygoing style. I loved the early songs of those early rockers, Eddie Cochran and those kind of people, because they had that, they had that swing.
So from wanting to be a blues guitarist, you ended up in a band with 3 possible guitarists, and you ended up being the singer.
Oh, I feel so exposed. What happened was, and this goes back to school, I started listening to a singer that recorded the soundtrack for Porgy and Bess. And his most famous song is called Old Man River. Old Man River.
Yeah. The guy who sang Old Man River was Paul Robeson.
Bingo. And when he sings, still to see, I can't even talk about it without getting emotional. But it led me to other older singers of colour. I started to discover this world of blues singers.
So when did you discover that you could actually sing?
I don't know. The 2 people who damaged me the most, which was Ivan and Colin, my biological father, also gave back in a sense, because they were musical.
But Angry, you started working as a fitter and turner. You joined this group from 1971 called Peace, Power and Purity, and now suddenly the singer. You're not a blues guitarist anymore.
No. Well, one of the blokes that became a member of that first band, and we were struggling, the 4 of us. We all had guitars.
Yeah.
And I couldn't play. So anyway, we needed a singer. Groups had singers. So we picked 2 songs, and one was Twist and Shout, which had just come out. And they said, no, well, you're the best at it. And I think what got me across the line was the Twist and Shout, because, I've always had that gravelly voice.
From Peace, Power and Purity, you came to the wider public notice and you became the lead vocalist with a band called Buster Brown, right?
Yes.
And if I'm correct, in Buster Brown, Bill Rudd was on drums and he left in 1974 to join AC/DC, right?
Yeah.
Then Buster Brown disbanded, and all of a sudden up comes Rose Tattoo. It's now 1976. Tell me about the formation of Rose Tattoo.
Well, the thing was that Mick answered an ad in the paper to join Buster. And he had this wonderful backbeat feel, which, of course, signatory as far as the real AC/DC lineup is. That's when they got young Geordie Leach. I think he was like 16 at the time. So we were struggling to find members, and we came to Sydney to look for players. And in the meantime, they were having trouble finding a singer. I'm trying to do Buster Brown, because I wanted to continue where Buster had left off. So over the next few months, what happened was the drummer was arrested trying to rob a bank, so they needed a drummer.
And the name Rose Tattoo had already been established, hadn't it?
Yes.
Any idea why that name?
Absolutely. The Rose Tattoo is a story. I think it's Tennessee Williams. We were sitting around one day at the pub, and he came up. What are you going to call the band?
Who would have ever thought that from those beginnings emerged this really hard rock band that takes Australia and much of the world by storm? Certainly you wouldn't have ever thought that, would you?
I don't think any of us did. I envisaged somewhere between the Rolling Stones and Sweet. The Rolling Stones component, charisma, and also, but the rootsy music, the blues roots music, because it was just a plodding blues up until then. When they renamed the album for overseas, the first album, they called it Rock and Roll Outlaws, not Rose Tattoo, because that's what we looked like. And that the sound was that outlaw sound. Mick and I wrote most of the songs on that album, Assault and Battery, and it just fell into place. Right. It was taken on a life force of its own.
Yeah. You guys had turned into the hard rock equivalent of these Outlaws, and as you said, the direction of the band had taken on a life of its own that nobody could have really predicted. Bad Boy for Love was your most popular single in 1977, wasn't it? It peaked at number 19. You say that Outlaws was your signature tune, but I think if I had to look back at Rose Tattoo now, I would remember you for Bad Boy.
Outlaw came out after Bad Boy. I know that we all hoped that Outlaw would be a bigger single, and it just wasn't, because it didn't have that romping, carefree, I'm a bad boy, a bad boy for love.
Harry Vanda and George Young, known as Vanda and Young, had produced Rose Tattoo's first 4 albums and had selected Bad Boy for the very first single. The pair were a whiz kid songwriting and production duo who also worked with other prominent Australian rock bands like AC/DC and The Angels. The two played a pivotal role in shaping the sound of Aussie rock music through the 70s and 80s.
George and Harry were magical in the studio at arrangements. George Young, older brother to Malcolm and Angus.
So how did you meet George and Harry? How did Rose Tattoo come together with Vanda and Young?
I remember being at the Station Hotel in Paran. Melbourne was the scene then. That was the first time AC/DC met Phil and saw him play with Buster. So sometime later, Buster was falling apart. They were looking for a drummer. He went with everyone's blessing because we just knew that it was going to work. Not long after that, in Sydney, the record companies in those days were signing any new band that showed any promise. The one band that no one wanted was the Tats. They all passed. Couldn't get a root in a brothel, as they used to say.
AC/DC and Rose Tattoo were both a huge part of the Australian hard rock scene and shared a connection through their record label. While they were both successful, the two bands had different approaches and rarely shared the stage despite their similar sounds and influence.
The connection between Phil and Bon, they introduced... Malcolm and Angus were aware of us, but they'd never been to gigs. So they brought along... They're the only members of another band that have ever jammed live at a Tats gig. They've got up and jammed with the band. Bon got up a few times and sang.
You were the same sort of ilk, weren't you? I mean, AC/DC and Rose Tattoo had loads in common.
Absolutely. Not musically, but character-wise. We were more a blues band. They were a blues-based rock and roll band. I remember Malcolm coming along one night. George said to Malcolm, "You got to come and see the band." We were both really enamoured with one another. The first time I ever saw them, like I said, they had the wrong bass player, the wrong drummer. They had the brothers playing guitar, and Bon had just joined the band. And I thought it was sensational. This is where it's going. I felt like I was part of that too. So we had that mutual respect and love for one another's music, but also for one another as people. And so George and Harry came along to a couple of gigs, and they said, "Come in to Albert's and we'll give you some downtime," which is like from midnight to like 6 a.m. They just said, "Look, record everything, every cover we ever knew, and any original songs, of course." They would come in the next day. We'd gone home, obviously, and they'd come in the next day and listen to what we recorded. We did that for 3 or 4 nights in a row. So then they called us in and they said, "We'd like to work with you." Being acknowledged by George and Harry, who were already the rock and roll institution. I mean, like Easy Beats, you got to be kidding. Like it was that was like pop rock at its best. But yeah, so they said, we'd like to work with you. And initially not to sign us. And they said, so we'll work on some music with you. And that's what happened. We went into the studio, we worked with George and Harry running the machinery, and we recorded stuff. Our first single was going to be a cover of Street Fighting Man, the Stones song, the Rolling Stones song. And they said, yeah, it's just like, this is the most accessible thing. So we'll put this out as a teaser. But then in the ensuing sessions, we started to write some tracks, Bad Boy and Snow Queen and Astrololi. Most of those songs Mick and I wrote.
You're obviously not feeling like a temporary member of the band anymore. You'd settled.
Not anymore, no. I'd woven.
You go off to tour Europe in 1981, and I believe you went pretty ape shit there. You're repeatedly head-butting the amp stacks until your head starts bleeding. What was going on for you there?
I got no idea.
we simply out of it and just out of it and into it?
Out of it and into it. Beautifully put. So poetically beautifully put. Yes. Absolutely out of it. That's a great. Why don't I write that down? Out of it and into it. Because I won't remember these things.
No, you and me both. I don't demand a writing credit for that one.
So if it pops up, a lyric in a song,
you can have it. Oh,
thank you so much.
That'd be awesome.
I think what happened was in those days, again, going back to Mangy Mick, who was the guy that nicknamed me Angry, one of the aspects of my personality was my aggressive approach to singing. And I would be physically aggressive. I would stalk, walk up and down the stage. And in those days, it wasn't fashionable. The singer stood in one place, maybe moved around a little bit, but, you was usually a bit of a dancer.
Like the Temptations.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, well, yeah, they were wonderful dancers. But I was more prowling and growling.
Love it. You certainly gave them an awesome stage show. Wherever you went, there was something to look at. And as you said, it wasn't the time. It had been all about the music until that point, and there was nothing to actually see. Rose Tattoo were amazing to go and see out live, predominantly because of the character that you were playing. I mean, yes, you still are Angry Anderson, but you played that right up. You hammed it up, and you gave the crowds something not only to hear, but something to really get their eyes into.
Thank you for that. The singer that used to excite me the most, James Brown. First time I ever saw James Brown. I remember having this conversation with Tina Turner. And I said, I couldn't believe James Brown the first time I saw it. I just thought, what is this man is possessed in the most wonderful way.
Yeah, the energy.
And I said to Tina, I said, and the same thing was, like I heard her sing before I saw her. And I said, I got the same feeling. It was these days it's described as being in the zone, in the moment. Obviously, any performer worth their salt is always in the moment. So you live every word. So every word's got its own life. So you try and inject and pull out of that word, let alone word, in a line in the song.
Yeah.
So I've always been a demonstrative singer. I've always, going back to my blues roots, I've always believed that if you're sitting on a stool, John Lee Hooker, you got a boogie, baby. Yeah, Mum, I got the boogie. No. To have that become alive, he put something into that, and he was non-animated. The only movement was the slight movement of his mouth, but it's his guitar playing. That was all the thing. And anyway, so part of what Angry Anderson became was living in the moment, in the sense that I was trying to draw as much out of every word, every performance as I possibly could. When you've taken it, or you feel that you've taken it so far, but you want to take it further, what do? we used to finish the set with Suicide City, and I would wrap a mic cord around my neck and choke myself till I passed out, or that I so deprived of oxygen that I would swoon. Could not retain my balance, blah, blah, blah. And it was a way of taking it that extra distance. Getting back to Reading, the sound on stage was just sensational. We never got a sound check like we do these days. We got a line check. We got a sort of but we were used to playing in a certain balance, like stage balance. So we knew our own balance. And I remember the fallback system was just extraordinary. I could hear everything in the band. It was the perfect storm. There was vodka involved. I did all my tricks. I spun them, like the Rod's Adultery thing with the mic cord,
Yeah.
and I'd done my James Brown stuff, with the mic stand, and except I didn't do the splits. And it just kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And the crowd would just off their heads. Like it just with us. Halfway through the set, we did Butcher, that slow burning blues.
It wasn't only the crowd at the Reading Festival that loved you, it was the whole British rock press that had totally fallen in love with you. One critic described you guys saying they were swaggering rock and roll desperados with hearts of gold. Another one said Rose Tattoo make Motorhead look like a chorus line in a ballet. They couldn't get enough of Rose Tattoo. You took the UK by storm.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Amazing. I mean, Australian bands are not known for that. Australian bands are not known for having that energy that you guys had. You just blew it out of the water completely. You actually led Rose Tattoo through 5 studio albums until the group disbanded in 87. Why did it come to an end?
We've been on and off again. Like it's almost like, and I remember Pete once saying, you've got to have something new to say, which is why we've only got 5 or 6 studio albums in all that time. Right. So it's one every 10 years. So we're not prolific. But the other thing too was that when you think about it, the chemistry, there was a volatility in the band that produced not only those performances, the headbutting of the guitar. I did this thing with Peter very, very early on where I would headbutt the guitar and he would use that and play off the sound that my head made hitting the strings. And of course, after you've done it a couple of times, the strings cut through your skin.
Oh, gosh.
So, yeah, really, it gets worse. There was this time and he was playing a solo and I was standing beside him between him and his amps. And there was at one stage where I reached up and grabbed the amp and it's fallen on because there was stacks, right? He had 2 down, 2 up top. And it's fallen over and it's hit me on the bridge of the nose. And apparently there's a little blood vessel in there. And the road crew run out, right, to pick the box up because it's fallen on me. I'm down on the ground. Pete's out the front soloing his heart out. And the crew picked me up and they dragged me to my feet and there's blood pissing out of my head. And then it was time to go back to the song. See, so that's where the vodka and the adrenaline meet up and marry and become this perfect storm. So I've gone out to Pete and he sort of looked at me and he's just gone, fuck, look at you, and I didn't realise I had blood all over me.
Right.
So I've sort of brushed it away and I realised I've got blood all over my hands and stuff. And that's when those photos were taken. That was that moment.
Did you ever come off stage or the next day with a severe hangover going, what the hell am I doing? I got to give this up. This is not a way to live.
Numerous occasions. Yeah. I remember there was one particular performance in America. We were on tour with Aerosmith. And when we did Suicide City, something that was a bit more dramatic, and I stole it out of a movie. Because in Suicide City at the end, when the band's playing out, I would put the mic cord around my neck and choke myself. And then I saw this thing in a movie where someone put a plastic bag over someone's head to suffocate them. Right? And the visual was extraordinary. The mouth opening, trying to gasp air. So I got this plastic bag and I out on the lip of the stage and I pulled it tight around it and I'm glaring down at the front row, seeing this look of sheer horror on all the groupies' faces, because they were all down the front waiting for Aerosmith. Anyway, I pass out. I fall into the pit. The security guys put me back on stage and they dragged me off stage. And it was just went over like huge. It was a real James Brown moment, where he used to stagger off and collapse, and then they put him back to his feet and he'd put a towel around him and he'd go, no, and he'd go back on stage and sing again. And I loved that theatre. Anyway, Aerosmith had a doctor. He said to me, don't do that. Don't suffocate yourself. He said, because you could cause brain damage. I think it has. He said, if you keep doing that, it'll kill you.
So you gave it up?
Yeah, I did it a couple more times.
Of course you did.
I had no recollection. None whatsoever. But,
Amazing.
I did. I gave it up sometime after that. The band broke up during that last tour of America because it was like done in two parts. And my daughter had just been born and I wanted to come back to Australia to meet her. The band were exhausted mentally and physically. But the real explanation is that always the periods that we've spent away from one another is because of the volatility of the characters in the band. You get to the point where, and I remember Peter saying this to me, don't worry about it. It's okay. It's all good. We need time away from it, it being the band.
The entity, yeah.
And, we'll get back together down the track. It was always wonderfully optimistic or prophetic, if you like, about the fact that it's okay. Particularly those early lineups, up until present lineup, they're an absolute delight to work with, this mob. It's not that the others weren't. It's just that we just drove one another mad. Like, you put us on stage, and I've listened to some of those live recordings, so I can say this in hindsight, as in my late 70s, that we were a fantastic rock and roll band on stage. Off stage, there were moments where we couldn't stand the sight of one another.
I think that's a familiar story. I mean, a lot of bands say same. Of all of the Rose Tattoo songs, Angry, which would you say was your favourite?
Title track for Scarred for Life, which was the album we toured America with. I think as a songwriter, as a lyricist, I'm not a songwriter, I'm a lyricist. I remember saying to a rock journalist, imagine how we're talking about the very thing about songs. And I said, if you wrote Walking on the Moon, not apart from the fact it became a huge hit, it's such an amazingly good pop song. That's how I feel about Scarred. I think it was the right song at the right moment. I think my performance is as good as could be had, or even to this day. I think there's one other song, which is my absolute favourite song, and it's off the last album, the Blood Brothers album, and it's a song that I wrote in dedication to Pete. It's called Once in a Lifetime. I think that's my favourite vocal performance, and it's also my favourite lyric. I think that was me at my best, is me at my best. But I think Scarred, because like Outlaw, and Outlaw has to be right there too. To me, Outlaw and Scarred for Life, that's the band.
I've had so many requests from listeners right around the world wanting to hear your story and hear you telling it in your voice. I had a request from Damien, who lives in Randwick in Sydney, probably just around the corner from you actually, who wrote me and said, get Angry to tell you about Suddenly, that uncharacteristic ballad that he did in 1987 that became your biggest hit, that went on to totally have a life of its own. Can you tell us a bit about that?
The first thing I need to tell you is that album should never have been released as a Rose Tattoo album. It's not. And it was that I joined Mushroom as a solo artist after the most recent breakup of the band. Right. And we'd done the Southern Stars thing, and Mark Opus was working with some Mushroom acts in those days, some of the biggest acts Australia's produced. He was one of the few people that said to me, I think we've got to try and get the best out of you out as a writer and a singer. And he said, no offense, it's not with the tats, because there's another side to you, right? So we did that album, Beats from a Single Drum. I signed to Mushroom as a solo artist. And the first collaboration with some beautiful, wonderful, gifted musicians, Andy Shishon, who now plays bass and has done for the last 400 years with Billy Joel. He also did all the major tours with Shania Twain. He co-wrote Suddenly. He was the bass player in the band, the Angry Anderson Band, along with some wonderful players. And we were doing that album. And what happened was that the American producer that was over here, thinking like a Californian, he saw potential. He thought that I should be singing soul. That's my other part. My other favourite music is Tamla Motown soul.
Yeah.
He said, I think we got to work towards having you write and sing some soul songs, right? And I said, okay. So we were writing songs for the album, and he said, we need some ballads to properly establish yourself. Getting back to this R&B thing, a lot of those songs are about love. So I want some songs out of you. And he said to Andy and I that are love songs. So I wrote Winnie Mandela, which is after I'd read her book. It's a great love story. He said, no. Yeah, okay, it's a great song. We love Winnie Mandela, which is a beautiful track. It's a great track. But it's written from a woman, a young woman's point of view, who fell in love with this champion of the people, who goes away, like very early in the marriage. He's off to jail for the rest of his life. And she's got a battle on her own. So she wrote this book. And I wrote this love song called Winnie Mandela, obviously. And no, that's not that. So I was writing this other lyric. And the story about Andy was he was playing bass in the band. So we were just sitting in the studio and trying to write a love song. And I said, well, I've got this lyric that I wrote when Roxanne, the first of our children, was born. I wrote about the emotions that I went through when I first saw her, this perfect child, this perfect human being, this blemish-free. And I remember the first time she looked at me, and I talk about it sometimes when I do public speaking about that moment for any father whose first child is a daughter. God, this has happened. She's 40-something now.
And it still brings you to tears. It's unbelievable. You are the most sweet man, the most emotional, passionate person. Who knew this? It's lovely.
Yeah, really. Mum used to say to me, your heart is the best part of you in some instances, how you feel about stuff. And her and I went through a lot of stuff together. Anyway, getting back to Roxanne. So I wrote down how I felt as a new father, as a man, as someone realizing in that moment I was saying goodbye to my past life. I remember saying to myself, my life's never going to be the same. And I was saying goodbye to everything, all the bad habits, whatever.
Yeah.
And I'd finally found something in life, someone in life, to fulfill me as a person, and took on a role as her father with the respect and the consideration that this perfect human being deserved. Every child deserves the best mother and best father. Over the next few days, I wrote down what I felt about that first moment. And it's that moment, suddenly you're seeing me just the way I am, because children aren't judgmental. Babies have no preconception of what their parent is or with their personality or whatever. That will all be revealed to them. And I knew through my own early years that my responsibility was to try and give her what I never had. So that's where the lyric came from.
So beautiful, Angry. It's so beautiful. And of course, for anybody who doesn't know, that song was used as the wedding theme for the Neighbours
Yeah.
episode, Australian soap opera television series, in which the popular characters Scott Robinson and Charlene Mitchell married. And that was, of course, Jason Donovan and Kylie Minogue before both of
Yeah.
them became absolutely huge. It reached number 3 on the UK singles charts. That must have blown you out of the water also.
Kylie told me years later that she chose the song, which I was absolutely chuffed that she did. And she was given a bunch of songs and she fell in love with Suddenly. I thought, because there's another love song on that album called Falling, which I think was a better song. So years later, Kylie tells me that she was adamant. She said they were trying to convince me maybe you should have a song. There was a couple of female artists that they offered her. Yeah, she said, I listened to them, but I want this one. God bless you, Kylie.
She made the right call, didn't she? Angry, you're absolutely incredible. You and I have been chatting for almost 2 hours. You take the award for the longest interview, and I've enjoyed every second of it.
Thank you. As I have. My mum used to say to me, you can talk under cement. But having said that, I got it from her.
I'm just blown away by the person that you are, Angry Anderson. And I think you probably go back to being called Gary, because I don't reckon there's too much angry left in you.
I'm angry about the war on humanity. There's definitely a lot to be angry about
in this world today.
Absolutely. Which is why I refuse to give up the name.
Angry, I love you. I have discovered who you are for the very first time in my life, having been listening to your music.
Don't tell anyone.
Promise. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.